Thank you very much. I'm, uh, I'm overwhelmed at the respect that I received coming through the door. And I'm originally, I actually am from Sutina, which is located in the southwest quadrant of the city. I've gone to school my entire life here. And in order to sort of make you feel comfortable to make myself feel comfortable, my grandfather was David Crowchild, named after Crowchild Trail. And I'm 74 years old. So 74 years ago, they started putting up fences around Sutina. We had Indian agents and we couldn't leave the reserves. Now, part of the discussion that they asked me to talk about was why is it important to understand Indigenous history and the challenges that Indigenous people have faced through people not being empathetic or even wanting to understand when they come into Canada. I think a lot of times when you all come into Canada, you have preconceived notions of us probably living in igloos and teepees, and that we're very uneducated and that we rely on welfare. You're going to hear a lot of that on social media by various young Indigenous people because there's a lot of anger in terms of systemic racism. I'm what they call a knowledge keeper. And I wanted to just let you know that when I was 10 years old, well, first of all, the grandson of Mahatma Gandhi, Raj Mohan Gandhi, came through from India when I was like about 8 to 10 years old. And he was looking for lumber in BC. And he met my grandfather, who was chief at the time. And he was impressed with my father. My father's name was Marina Crane, and he had served in World War II. He invited him to South America and India. And so my father and mother both traveled at that time when I was 8 and 10. And because of that, the stories that they brought back of the world, you have to understand that the Indigenous people here, we did, like I saw my first white person when I was 5 years old. To understand, like the city of Calgary is over 1 million people. In the 70s, in Sutina, the cultural shock of people coming into the city and the way they were treating our men with racism, you have to understand too, my father and my uncles were cowboys. But they took a lot of really hard jobs in the city. And there was a lot of alcohol and drug abuse because the majority of my parents, my mother, when she was 5 years old, was put into Indian residential school. And my father as well, and also my grandmother. So in punishment, my father ran away, and in punishment, as a child, they caught him and they put him into an attic in the cold to sleep with the dead bodies of Indigenous children. My mother could read and write in the Dakota language because we originally came from the United States of America, and she was part of the mass execution of Dakota people from Abraham Lincoln. They hung 38 Sioux people and they chased the Sioux to Canada. So in Canada, you have 9 Sioux tribes that are exiled from the United States. Now, I'd like you to understand too that 500 years ago, when the settlers first came in here, there were millions of Indigenous people. They estimated that for the first 100 years, they killed 5 generations of Indigenous children. That's 125 million children that were killed by the colonizers in the Americas. And that's the Portuguese, the French, the Dutch, the English, and the French. Now, again, what was the contribution of Native Americans to society here? Well, we contribute at least 60 to 70% of the vegetables that you consume today. Corn, beans, like you can Google it, you'll find it there. So when my parents went to South America when I was 8, and they went to the Lost City of Machu Picchu, and they saw these huge monuments that Native Americans had built. And just understand now, only in this past 20, 30 years have they started to talk about the contributions of Native Americans in the society here. A lot of the times, there was no curriculum in schools. So for me, a lot of the things that I learned and a lot of the responsibility I had to show my own self-respect, my own identity, was because of the stories my parents brought back from South American India. The thousands of people they saw. When my father and mother were in India, John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And she said that there was a huge crowd in the market. And she said the Indians just fell to the ground and started praying because they thought it was the end of the world. So the impact that the United States has had on the world in itself is phenomenal. Now, that being the case too, understand this, for generations, they've been trying to kill Indigenous people, especially women. In South Dakota, in the United States, there is a town that was created just by settlers to hunt Dakota Sioux women who were pregnant. And they would track them down and gut them and take out their unborn babies and take their scalps as well as the bones. When you see a Sioux woman dancing in the powwow, you will see her wear a knife and you'll see moccasins of little babies. When I worked on the movie set Bury My Heart in Wounded Knee, and the white consultants were asking about the oral history of the Dakota Sioux people, I had to tell them how my parents, my great-grandparents, my great-grandmother was like 5 years old, and her parents were in their mid-30s when they came across through Montana, up into Alberta, into northern Alberta, into Saskatchewan, down into Manitoba. They took all the Sioux people out of the state of Minnesota. There were bounties, scalps on their heads. Now, when people ask me about customs and traditions and the loss of identity, we, as matriarchs, I was raised a matriarch because I live in Western Canada. The majority of Indigenous people who live in Eastern Canada have 100 years more experience with systemic racism. So when we say in Western Canada, we're very family oriented, it's because we still believe in community. We still believe in, we're not individuals, we're holistic and collective. And because of that, we have a chief and council. And because of that, we try as a community to heal ourselves. And through all the genocide and through all the propaganda to make us ashamed of who we are, we've healed ourselves. So we continue healing ourselves. So much of the practices that I do talk about, like I could create like a really nice fairy tale story, but see, Disneyland has already done that for you. And probably when you came into Canada, there weren't that many people who could educate you about the Indigenous peoples in Canada. Like there are hundreds of us, thousands of us, and we have different languages, and again, different ways that we were raised. Now, the problems as Indigenous women for what I've grown up in is called misogyny. It's called gender apartheid. Indigenous women couldn't marry who they wanted to marry. They would have to lose their status. And because we're tribal people, when the women married white men or any other man that wasn't Indigenous, we would lose connection to our communities. So when I talk to a white man, and in my Sioux language it'd be Wasichus, when I talk to a Wasichu, and I say to them, do you know the history of Indigenous women? I said, do you know in Canada, the Indigenous woman couldn't marry who she wanted if she married a white man? And if he was racist, she had to put up with him. I said, and she'd have children with him. And then if she wanted a divorce, he'd take her children. She'd have no community, no family, because she was disowned. The government set this up to destroy our family units. And so when I talk to a white man and I say to him, those children, mixed blood children, they grow up being ashamed of being Indigenous. And some of them will admit that their fathers are racist. And some of them will admit that their fathers will be racist until the day they die. Now, those young people are advocates today, and they try to connect to their Indigenous communities. So a lot of times when you see Indigenous people in Calgary, most of the time you'll probably see them downtown homeless. Understand this, the largest population of Indigenous people in North America is in southern Alberta. You don't see us because we go back to our communities, like in Siksika, Sudina, Stonies, and in Pagan, like down south of the Blood Reserve. The majority of us who come into the city come in to work or they go home at night. Those 40,000 or 50,000 Indigenous people who live in Calgary from across Canada are the people that you see. They're not from within the community in the land from here. They've come into the city, just like you. Now, the majority of times when you meet Indigenous people, you have to understand that they come from different backgrounds, different languages, and different customs. I just finished coming back from the United States last week, 2 weeks ago. I had, for 20 years, I had written on a blog and warned somebody about a medicine man who had come into our communities who was sexually assaulting our girls. He traveled through Alberta, BC, Saskatchewan, North Dakota, South Dakota, Ontario, California, and he did these horrific things to our children. And because there were a lot of people, Indigenous people who live in the cities, who had no connection to their communities, he preyed on them because they wanted to know whether it was Indigenous. That means our Indigenous children lost their identity and wanted to know who they were. And this man took advantage of them. And you will see that. I grew up in Sudina, and there were a lot of mixed blood people who were ashamed to be Indigenous. It wasn't until the 60s, Indigenous people couldn't vote. And Indigenous women couldn't marry who they wanted to marry. I think until the 1990s, the 1980s, that women could start making applications to move back home onto their reserves. This gender apartheid is still entrenched in our communities. It's called infantilization, that the Indian agents, the white people who came into our communities and monitored us, we couldn't leave our communities unless we had a pass to leave. The denial of all the children that they killed in those residential schools is still there. Now, I'm a survivor in residential school, but I'm also a survivor of day school, Indian hospitals. You have to understand the segregation that took place in Canada. I may sound like I'm well educated, but I've been places, and I am. But sometimes a lot of people who are my age as elders will not speak up. And so you will very rarely find someone who's Indigenous around my age who has this knowledge that I'm talking about. But because of that, I'm really honored and grateful to have been invited here to talk, because as people who have a whole country of your own, who have a rich background of where you lived and the villages and communities and towns that you came from, you understand your culture, you understand your language, you have families, you have connection, you have something. And for you to understand how fragmented Indigenous people have been for the past 500 years. Like, understand this. This country was based on stolen land, and it was taken from us at a very big price. Do you know, with an Indigenous woman, because we don't have sovereignty over our children, our programs for child and family are based on provincial standards. So in our communities, we don't have sovereignty. So when a single mom who has 5 kids, she dies, all her children are put into the social services system and are brought into the city of Calgary for foster parents to raise, who aren't Indigenous themselves. An hour east of here in the reserve called Siksika, there are at least, I think, 12,000 children who are in the foster care system in the city of Calgary. The average age for Indigenous children to be trafficked in the city and in Canada is 14 years old. They target our Indigenous children, they target our girls, because the people who are trafficking, and it's mostly women who help traffic our girls, and they're not Indigenous and some are. The reason they do that is because we are able to dress up as Mexican, Chinese, any ethnic background, Indigenous people can be uh, dressed up to play in trafficking. The horrors and the understanding of what it is to be like the process of grooming and trafficking is horrific. I know there are children here, so I won't describe that process. But I will tell you that we're not allowed, we don't have money to have group homes or shelters for our children when they're apprehended. So the majority of the things that we try to do and what you hear on the news in terms of people saying our children are falling through the cracks, that's because of systemic racism. The government has set this up, and even though you may think that, oh, well, they're getting educated, a lot of times when our children come into communities, they learn Vietnamese, they learn Italian, they learn any other language the foster parent has. And so when they want to come back to our communities, it's really hard for them. So even though you're in a free country and you believe in the Disneyland or the Hollywood Wild West, it's very hard for me to sit down and talk to someone when they're asking me questions about privilege, because I know what white privilege looks like. I know what it is to try and find a white ally. The majority of times, any stories Indigenous people have to say means nothing if it's coming from other Indigenous people supporting us. The story I'm talking about happened 3 years ago. The show CBC did a program called where they arrested a medicine man, and they put him on the Fifth Estate, which was a national TV, and I was featured in that. 20 years I warned people in Canada and the United States. It took a white organization like CBC to put on the news before people listened. That's what you call systemic racism. If a native program, APTN, were to broadcast that same story, it wouldn't have had the same impact. So for me, as an Indigenous woman and a person of color, when it comes for me to make a point across, I have to go to a person who's white privileged for them to validate my story and for them to get something moving. My entire life, like I said, my grandfather was David Crowchild after Crowchild Trail. My father worked with the mayor of Calgary. My uncles and them took part in the Calgary Stampede. You know, when the Calgary Stampede came in and when they first started, they used to dress me up. I was like a zoo animal. In the Indian village, they take pictures of me. It took a long time for me to even want to have my photograph taken. The oil riggers in northern Alberta, understand, Alberta is the third largest oil producer in the world. So when we had oil workers coming in from northern Alberta to come to the Calgary Stampede for rest and relaxation, they came in to be with our Indigenous girls. So prostitution has been quite historical because we did not have social services. We didn't have anything to feed our children. And so whatever means we could to make sure our children were protected, we did it. So every time when you have the Calgary Stampede, I think out of every dollar that's being spent during the year, 75 cents of it is made from tourism that comes into the city to celebrate that Wild West show. It's produced by oil companies, and those oil companies understand too, the Indian residential schools, when they first started to do this, was in the 1860s. On the Cloud Trail on Deerfoot, you'll have an industrial school where they recruited young boys to educate them into farming, husbandry, anything. Then they realized, oh, they're going to go home and they're going to marry Indigenous girls, and those girls are going to turn them back to savages. So they said in Parliament, it's written in Parliament, that we're going to educate Indigenous girls, and we'll start in residential schools. So in southern Alberta, and Alberta has the largest Indian residential schools in Canada. You've got to understand big business and big oil. They did this to us. My late uncle died 49 years ago. And he was quite radical and quite proactive. He says, the white man created this problem, let them solve it. So a lot of the things that you see in Indigenous people on the streets in Calgary is only a fraction of what we're living with. For me, as an Indigenous woman, I've never married. I've never had children. The majority of the women that I've grown up with, I've had to bury, either from drug abuse or on the streets. The systemic racism and the gender apartheid is still alive. The majority of our women are missing and murdered. Last year, the Sutuna police opened a sting operation, and they went online saying they were 15-year-old girls, 15-year-old Indigenous girls. Within a span of 24 hours, they had 5,000 hits. Can you imagine that? 5,000 men went online trying to buy sex from a 15-year-old Indigenous girl. And out of that, they arrested 10 men. So however you think and however you see Indigenous women, and however you think that our lives are not worth it, believe me, we are matriarchs. We are matriarchs and we are respected. When you come into my community and you ask people who I am, they will tell you. Why? Because they know I have a voice. They know I've been advocating my whole life, trying to educate people. I grew up my whole life with white people. You know, it wasn't easy being called squaw, wagon burner. It wasn't easy, you know, getting good grades and then jealous of me because they thought I was too stupid to be intelligent. I did a presentation in front of some academics at the University of Calgary. And I was saying, when my mother was having children, she thought she was going to have a litter of puppies. And one of the white academics started laughing in the audience. And I said to her, you know why my mother thought that? I said, because she was raised by white people in those Indian residential schools. They never hugged her, never praised her. They treated her lower than a dog. A dog was treated better than how they treated my mother and my father. When my grandmother used to try and visit my mom when she was just a child, she used to braid her hair. She says, it broke my heart when they took my grandmother and put her in the basement and had her sleep on a bed of straw. You know, throughout my whole life, the systemic racism. And you'll feel it and you'll sense it. And you've probably already experienced it in the hospitals, the police system in Calgary. I'm really grateful that you've come into Calgary. When I was growing up in Calgary, I said, just wait. There'll be people, dark-skinned people coming in to the city who will hear and feel the way I felt. And it makes white people, they call it fragility, because they feel uncomfortable because they're not the minorities. And in order to educate people and cause a ripple effect of what systemic racism does, I'm grateful to have been invited and to talk about the history that you probably have never heard. And unless you Google it or you meet somebody like myself who isn't going to lie about it and is going to tell you the truth, because you know, I'm a matriarch. The whole system of a woman and how we raise our children has been handed down for thousands and thousands of years. You know, we're whatever colonizers and patriarchy in the European culture has, it's not as valuable as being matriarchs and being tribal. I just wanted to say that message to you, and again, I'm very grateful and humbled to be in your presence. I don't know where they got my name to come and talk, but thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer.